today? Today's
23rd.
23rd. Today is Wednesday, March 23rd, take one for our computer dealer history notes. This is being prepared at the request of Bob Rinaldi and his Pioneers in Leasing and the Road Less Traveled. I'm Ed Cherney, and I've been in the business a long time, about 40 years, and I thought I would just go over each company, each era, with a few highlight stories from different times in the industry. I started in 1964 with Burroughs, which is now Unisys, and I sold adding machines that could foot numbers and cross foot numbers. That's all they could do. I spent 2 years there. Then I went to Frieden, and Frieden is no longer in business, and the big revolution that they had was a machine that could multiply. And their most popular model was the Frieden 5015. It was at Frieden that I had a requirement for an IBM key punch. And the key punch connected to the Frieden machine, and it created an 80-column tab card with printing across the top. And I was surprised to learn that even though this machine was 20 or 25 years old, I had to pay $500 over list price. So after going through that experience, I joined up with another Burroughs salesman, and the company's name was Marbeau, M-A-R-B-E-A-U, and in those early days we concentrated on IBM tab equipment, primarily the key punches. One of the most interesting stories of that era was IBM had 3 junkyards throughout America where they sent the tab equipment to be destroyed, especially the 026 key punches. And the junk man was instructed to hit it once over the top where the printing mechanism was and once on the side. So after discovering this junkyard and buying it, it was about 3 or 4 stories high, as long as a football field. We retained a mathematics guy from the University of Michigan to go up to Rochester, Minnesota, walk the top of the pile, walk along the side, and make a calculation as to how many key punches would be on the inside of that pile. Well, my first lesson learned in the used business, there's always somebody smarter and one step ahead of you. It turns out the junk man had been notified of the value of the 026s, and the only thing in the pile were the few scattered across the top and a few scattered on the inside. So the next move that we made to get machines for that market was we searched out the supplier of the printing mechanism, which was called a punch-die interposer, and we found 2 suppliers, one in Connecticut, one in Germany. Well, the Connecticut supplier, even though the machines were past the patent period, were completely tied up in paperwork with IBM. They would not sell to us. The German company gladly sold to us. We produced many, many machines, took non-printers, 024s, converted them to printers, and it took IBM about 2 years to find out what we did and shut us down. Another interesting learning on international finance, the first international deal I did was selling 24 key punches to be delivered in Hamburg, Germany. I had an irrevocable letter of credit, sent it to a bonded warehouse, and on the day that we presented the letter of credit, they opened the boxes, and all 24 machines had been stolen. So that was my first recognition of welcome to the world of international finance. It was at Marbeau that I also sold my first used computer, which was an IBM 7074, and some years later I sold it to Chuck Greenfield. The machine was located at the London Life Insurance in London, Ontario, and the broker on the machine was George Heilborn. Well, we convinced the customer that we wanted to be a dealer, not a broker. The customer supported us by saying that CMI or Marbeau controlled the machine, and we sold it. And a couple years later, when Chuck came to town, I apologized because I said, Chuck, we made so much on that machine, I want to go state's evidence. And he started laughing so hard, I thought he was going to choke on his beer. He said, that's all you made? He broke the machine in half, which I didn't know you could do, sold one side for a $500,000 profit, put the other half out on a federal government lease for a 5-year term, and he said he expected it to be there for 10 years. After the demise of Marbeau, my next venture was the CMI Corporation, which was started in 1970, and we started with sales, at zero. And I remember we were primarily a dealer. We would buy and sell for cash. But 2 or 3 years into our selling period, we did our first lease. And I was sitting with the purchasing agent at one of the automotive companies, and the gentleman asked me what my 5-year lease rate was. And I told him, we don't have a 5-year lease rate. It's 2 machines, 25 each is $50,000. So he took a sheet of paper, put the $50,000, added 7% interest per year for 5 years divided by 60, and he said, this is your lease rate. And he said, and if you take this contract that I will give you, or this purchase order, the bank will discount it, which I did, and the bank discounted it, and I am happy to report that that machine stayed in place at the same account. It was at a design studio, so it was sort of isolated, and they paid the same rent for 10 years. During those CMI days, we got the volume up to about 200 million. We had coverage throughout the country, and in 1982, we sold CMI to Torchmark. At the time we did the deal, they were called Liberty National Life Insurance in Birmingham, Alabama. When we actually closed, it was in the name of Torchmark. And a little side story, after the deal was closed, the chairman, Mr. Frank Sanford Jr., said, Ed, is there anything special I can do for you on this great day for you? And I said, well, I'm a golf fan, and I would really like to know if I could have a couple tickets to that new senior tour that you're sponsoring called the Legends of Golf. And he said, well, Ed, I'll be glad to get the tickets to you, but that's Liberty Mutual, and we used to be Liberty National. So that was an embarrassing moment. Some of the highlights of that era, of the 1970 eras, which were the golden days for the leasing companies. There were two groups of people selling IBM equipment. There were the large leasing companies like DPF, Leaseco, Booth, Itel, Randolph, Dearborn, and there were their dealers who primarily sold for cash. And the dealers included Tom Disco, Forsyth and MacArthur, CSI in St. Louis, CMI, and the larger leasing companies looked down on the dealers, like we were playing the small game and they were playing the large game. The supposed originator of the original lease was Saul Steinberg of Leaseco, and as I had the story told to me, it was a paper that he wrote as he was completing his degree at the Wharton School of Finance. And the basic business model that all of the leasing companies used was an original 5-year lease with a strong credit, bulletproof A credit, and they depreciated equipment over 8 years, and basically they all, during the first 5-year period, could make the profits whatever they wanted. So the larger the residual, the more profits they were showing on an annual basis. The accounting standards were not like they have evolved to over the past 25 years, so there was a lot of divergence on how income was reported. Those were high-flying days by the big leasing companies with lavish conventions, $100 bills thrown from balconies, renting entire cruisers for sales meetings. It was some high-flying time. Well, eventually the bank started getting nervous about this business model because what happened at the end of the lease. And the early leasing companies were sort of like our first foray into Iraq, which is, we won the battle, what do we do now? The leasing companies had made no provision for remarketing the equipment. There were no studies done on what residual performances should be, and as the equipment started to come back, people didn't know what to do. Well, lo and behold, there were a couple of entrepreneurs who came up with a great solution, and they got on the plane, flew to London, and met with Lloyd's of London, and came up with what was infamously called the Lloyd's policy. And for the handful of people that had it, it was it reestablished their ability to finance 100% of the equipment in the marketplace. What Lloyd's thought they were insuring was the likelihood of the equipment coming out in the first 5-year period. In reality, the people that had the Lloyd's policy were using it as a financial guarantee. And the people that didn't couldn't get their equipment financed. The people that had it, of course, were winning all of the deals. Well, lo and behold, everything was rosy for a few years until the first claim was made against Lloyd. Lloyd's of London refused to pay. Equipment started backing up in the warehouses, and eventually the entire large leasing company's business model disintegrated. The largest user of the policy, of course, was ITEL. A little side story: 2 to 4 years later, when this equipment was all still in the warehouse, I received a call with my role as a dealer to give Lloyd's some estimate as to what their loss would be. And I flew to New York, went to the biggest conference room I'd ever seen in my life. Every major law firm that was on the Lloyd's side of the fight were in this conference room. And they said, Mr. Cherney, what do you think? And I said, well, in some research I've done, I understand there's a tradition that when a ship of sea goes down, Lloyd's rings a bell to notify everybody on the floor of the ship. And I said, gentlemen, there are so many machines in the warehouse and so many coming, you better put a new sound system in for this problem. So that was the demise of the that was the demise. But as I said, the dealers who were looked down on, their business model, which was based on what we call RHC, real hard cash, came to the forefront. And as a dealer, you would know at the end of each transaction whether you had made money on the machine or lost money on the machine. And then over the rest of that decade, the dealers started doing more and more leasing, but their core competency was their ability to put together a team to remarket the equipment at the end of the lease. Also, some interesting stories during this era. CMI launched income funds after our sale. Well, we started just before the sale to Torchmark, and we raised $350 million, primarily for peripherals, and put them out on lease and sold these income funds to the public. We originally started with Raymond James and then ended up with Waddell and Reed because they were also owned by Torchmark. During that period, we also raised $90 million for a CMI aircraft fund, and it was a good thing we were good in computers because we weren't as good in the aircraft. Other interesting highlights of that era, I remember we had a lot of lease customers down in Houston in the oil business, and when China allowed the oil companies to come over for exploration, they brought all the same systems that they had in Houston, and we delivered them certified for IBM maintenance. We were paid before they left the country, and to this day, I don't know who serviced them or what they did. And also during that period, the used market opened in Japan, and of course Condisco was the leader. They got 10 or 12 major CPUs in. We were on their trail. We put about 5 in. And I have to say, to the credit of the Japanese government through their Ministry of Trade, it took them about 90 days after the 18th machine hit the shore to determine that they weren't going to tolerate that. The laws were instantly changed, and to the best of my knowledge, no used equipment after they put the hammer down ever went into Japan. At the end of at the 6 years after our sale to Torchmark, Mr. Sanford died from cancer, and as I said, he's one of the best gentlemen I ever met in my life. But he had put into place, prior to his death, he had sold 25% of the company back to the employees. And prior to his death, he had put into place an agreement that is called a shootout agreement or a Baltimore chop. And what this consisted of, whichever party wanted to buy 100% of the company put a number on the table. So in our case, we put a number of $115 million on the table. Then the other party had the right to be the buyer or the seller of the equipment. So after putting the number on the table, I flew down to Birmingham, Alabama, and after the death of Mr. Sanford, they brought for the first time ever an outsider, not a family member, into the insurance company as chairman. And during our dinner in a private room, the chairman said, "How do I know that you are good for the money, Ed?" And I said, "It's very simple. When the bank opens tomorrow, I'm prepared to wire transfer you the whole amount." And apparently he didn't like that answer, and he put a Khrushchev move on me. He took his shoe off, slammed it on the table, and said, "I will crush you like an ant, and you will never have this company." And true to his word, on the morning of the 30th day, he announced that he, in fact, would buy the company for $115 million, because he, in turn, was flipping it to CIS out of Syracuse, and they closed on the transaction on the 30th day. An interesting side note is that CIS, which borrowed the majority of the money from a major insurance company, filed Chapter 11 1 year to the date of when they purchased the equipment, and ended up liquidating the company. I'm also happy to say, as a footnote, that my original bank, Comerica, which had a $70 million line, which was their legal lending limit for a non-automotive company, were secured and received 100 cents on the dollar on that transaction. After the sale of CMI, another company was formed was called Encore, and Encore was started in 1987. They started from scratch. I did not join the company at that time because I had 9 months remaining on a non-compete, and on the evergreen clause there was 9 months remaining. After the expiration of my buy-sell, I came back to join the former management team of CMI at Encore. One of the first things that we did in those early years was we secured a major consulting agreement with AT&T, the phone company, which had just been broken up by federal mandate into the regional Bell operating companies and AT&T in Morristown, New Jersey. They were evaluating whether or not to build their own in-house leasing company. And the presentation that we had put together, and I gave it to, I would say, 10 major AT&T executives, was the 5 best things that IBM Credit had done, in my view, over the previous 5 years, and the 5 worst things they did. At the end of the day, AT&T decided to go into the business, and of course became a major force in the leasing company. A couple years after that, AT&T Capital bought the Encore Group, and we became a division of AT&T Capital. And I have to say, I had 8 enjoyable years there. I learned some things that I had never done before. For example, the concept of financial modeling, planning over a 5-year horizon, what happens if this factor changed or that factor, and that training has served me well in the last half of my career. During our time there, our average sales the last 5 years were $400 million. We had $100 million in equity. We did $1.2 billion in assets, and our EBITDA was $30 million, and our net after tax was $15 million for a 15% return on equity. And I was very proud of the record that we established there. Now, when AT&T then decided to get out of the financial business, in 1997, they sold the company, AT&T did, to Nomura Securities from Tokyo, and the deal was handled out of London by Mr. Guy Hands. And I left AT&T Capital in the summer of '87, and the deal had closed. And shortly thereafter, I was no longer there, so I don't know the exact dates, but in late 1997, early 98, it turns out that Nomura decided to get out of the leasing business, and they in turn sold the company to Newport, which was a public health company up in Toronto. And so some interesting stats there. Nomura between a combination of mostly cash and stock, got all of their money out. That deal closed in 1998. And then, of course, a whole series of events happened after that. Newport sold to CIT. CIT ended up selling to Tyco. Tyco sold it back to CIT for 50 cents on the dollar. And it was during that period when I was out of the industry for a number of years that half of the AT&T Systems Leasing Group left to form Tip Capital. In about 1988, Tip Capital started. And then I came back into the leasing business to join Tip Capital in 2003. I came back after an unsuccessful attempt to purchase the Comdisco International portfolio. God rest his soul, Ken Ponticus had died, and Comdisco decided to do other things and leave the core business. After doing the due diligence, I passed on with my investment group on Comdisco Europe. We then took a run at Comdisco US, which was purchased by someone else, who raised the bid $5 million in the ninth inning, and I would not match that. And there I was. I still wasn't back in the business. So meeting with our investment bankers, who were Morgan Joseph, Fred Joseph, who was the guy that Mike Milken used to report to, had throughout this whole period maintained his own investment firm. And it was through his efforts that he set up a couple of investor groups, and we were able to secure an equity investment and some subordinated debt, which substantially increased Tip Capital's capital resources to go into the market. So since that time period, I have now been back in the business another 7 or 8 years, and it's been another learning experience. We do equipment primarily in U.S. and Canada, although we do have some equipment in Mexico, and we're getting started in Europe. And we primarily lease new equipment now. There's very little used activity in the marketplace today, and most of the bets that we and other leasing companies make are on our expectation of the customer's behavior at the end of the lease. So that's sort of the history of how I started and how many years I've been in. A couple of things that Bob Rinaldi asked the other interviewees were some words of wisdom and what are some remembrances. I guess my words of wisdom are: nobody's exempt from gravity. Accept the reality of each situation. It is what it is, and wishing it was something different isn't going to change it. Of course, I think all the guys that have stood the test of time have integrity, and as I tell my kids and I tell all the salesmen, it takes years to develop a reputation and one stupid deal to lose it. And my other philosophy of life is aim low, show up every day. If you take care of things on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, the future will take care of itself. And always be direct, whether you're dealing with another leasing company, with an end user. Speak in plain language, net out what you think, so there are no misunderstandings. Bob also asked the other people, who are some people that I admire in the business. Well, obviously myself, like many other, my number one guy that I admired, and if he hadn't cut the trail that he did, I don't think any of us would be here today, and that's Ken Ponticus. God rest his soul. He's now been dead about 17 years. And I learned a lot from him. Just a couple little side stories. Comdisco had a hunting camp about an hour and a half from their Chicago offices, which was fantastic. And every Thanksgiving they had a father-son where they invited dealers from all over the country. And I'm happy to say that my 3 older boys all went to the camp with me. Well, I had never shot a gun before, so they had a guy train you on how to shoot a gun. And after our first day of hunting, I was the only one in our party to be birdless. And as we approached the lodge walking in at the end of the day, in a very large tree very close to the lodge sat a beautiful pheasant. And Ken said, "Take him, Ed." And I said, "Yeah, but the instructor said if we're near the cabin or the lodge, don't shoot." He said, "Take him." So I succeeded, and finally I got my bird, and when he landed, it was headless. And to my surprise, 2 months later, Ken shipped to me the headless pheasant as a memorial to my first pheasant success. And I'm happy to report that some years later, at a black tie event in New York, where they honored some of the early pioneers in the business, including Ken Ponticus, Pod Booth, and a few other people, I presented a gold necklace around the headless pheasant back to Ken, and the inscription said, "It's not worth losing your head on any one deal." And he got a kick out of that. Other memories of Ken: he was such a warm, caring person. I remember the day that I lost CMI on the Texas shootout. The very first phone call I got was from Ken saying, "Ed, you'll be back. You'll be bigger and better than ever. You know the business, and don't worry about it." It was very comforting. My second guy that I'm the most fondest of is Frank Chartier, God rest his soul. He died at age 46. He was my right-hand man for 25 years, and we had many years. He was my corporate conscience and kept me on the straight and narrow. He was the youngest guy ever in the state of Texas to pass all of his CPA things, and I think he was 18 or outside 19 years old. And his hobby in life was horse handicapping. And when he retired from the leasing business, his goal was to become the writer, the handicapper for the New York Times. Other people that I admired who have stood the test of time, of course, are Rick Forsyth out of Chicago, Ken Steinbeck out of St. Louis, John Allen out of San Francisco, Mike Morrell, who helped me a lot in the early days by allowing me to remarket the entire LeaseCo portfolio, and Tom Wainert, who I've worked with at AT&T and who is still in the business. And lastly, it was the automotive guy at the who showed me how to do my first lease on the 2311s. The last two things that Bob Rinaldi asked to cover were how would you like to be remembered, Ed? And I guess number one, I'd like to be remembered as a survivor in an industry that's chewed up a lot of people. As I tell my kids and I tell younger salesmen, it's easier to handle the struggle than it is the success. And I've seen a lot of guys get to the top and they couldn't handle it once they got there. So surviving in this industry, whoever you are, is something to be remembered. And I'd like to be remembered as a guy who lived his life with balance. I got 5 kids. They all turned out straight, and I'm happy with that. And then a common thing that I share with a lot of the people that I said I admire in the business was giving back to the community. All of the people that I mentioned in their own way give back to the community. And I also think it's important to have relationships and remain yourself your whole life. I got the same friends that I had in high school, college, through the church, through business, and I think that's very important. The last question that Bob asked, what are your favorite books, or what 3 books do you remember the most? Today I'm an avid reader of both history and fiction, but I would say the top 3 books are Atlas Shrugged, which I read either my last year of college or my first year out, and I found out I could buy them in hardback, and I give them away as high school graduation presents to all my kids, to all my friends' kids. The second, early in my career, I was introduced to a motivational book called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, and I followed those tenets, and they became part of what my selling core was my whole life. And the third one I was introduced to by one of my sons, which is The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck, which has served me well over the years. So that's my story. That's 40 years. I think working keeps me young. I enjoy it, and I look forward to good health and good leasing in the days to come. Thank you. How long?
29 minutes and 6 seconds.
Hey, we're getting